All right, I have an article here from The Atlantic entitled The Alarming Scope of the President's Emergency Powers, which was published in February of 2019, just about a year ago. And I will say here that I will not read the whole thing because it's very long, and it is about all the awful things that Trump can do if the orange man decided to throw a temper tantrum. So I'm not going to read it because it's stupid. Those parts of it, it's all a damn dog and pony show, and if you haven't figured that out, God help you. But this is a bigger thing, okay? This is deeper. There's a much bigger picture here. The moment the president declares a national emergency, a decision that is entirely within his discretion, he is able to set aside many of the legal limits on his authority. It would be nice to think that America is protected from the worst excesses of a government hell-bent on enslaving their people. It doesn't say that. I'll interject from time to time because I can't help myself. Unknown to most Americans, a parallel legal regime. Parallel legal regime. Think about what that means. Allows the president to sidestep many of the constraints that normally apply. The moment the president declares a national emergency, a decision that is entirely within his discretion, more than 100 special provisions become available to him. 123 maybe? While many of these tee up reasonable responses to genuine emergencies or ingenuine emergencies, some appear dangerously suited to, well, we'll rewrite this, a government hell-bent on enslaving its people. For instance, the president can, with the flick of his pen, activate laws allowing him to shut down many kinds of electronic communications inside the United States or freeze Americans' bank accounts. Other powers are available even without a declaration of emergency, including laws that allow the president to deploy troops inside the country to subdue domestic unrest. This evidence of extraordinary powers has historically rested on the assumption that the president will act in the country's best interest. That's not happened in my lifetime. Okay, a loaded weapon. The premise underlying emergency powers is simple, is it? It is simple, but not this. The government's ordinary powers might be insufficient in a crisis, and amending the law to provide greater ones, not better ones, greater ones, more powerful laws against us, might be too slow and cumbersome. Boo-hoo. Emergency powers are meant to give a government a temporary boost until the emergency passes or there is time to change the law through normal legislative processes, which never happens. They don't change them and take them away. They don't repeal the Patriot Act, Barack Obama. Unlike the modern constitutions of many other countries, our antiquated constitution does not specify when and how a state of emergency may be declared and which rights may be suspended. Inalienable rights? Suspended? The U.S. Constitution itself includes no comprehensive, separate regime for emergencies. Those few powers it does contain for dealing with certain urgent threats is assigned to Congress, not the President. Like the Congress can suspend the writ of habeas corpus and allow government officials to imprison people without judicial review in case of a rebellion. And it could also call the militia forth to execute the laws of the Union and suppress insurrections. Nevertheless, some legal scholars do believe that the Constitution, in fact, gives the President inherent emergency powers by making him Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces or by vesting in him a broad, undefined executive power. At key points in American history, presidents have cited inherent constitutional powers when taking drastic actions that were not authorized. I won't read them all, but we can go right to the hero Abraham Lincoln. He conceded that his unilateral suspension of habeas corpus during the Civil War was constitutionally questionable only, but defended it as necessary to preserve the Union. And the Supreme Court has often upheld such actions, or even found ways just to avoid reviewing them altogether. Great job. The boundary of the President's constitutional authority during emergencies remains poorly defined. There is no boundary. Presidents can also rely on a cornucopia of powers provided by the Congress. I won't read all that, but it does go on to say here that a more formalized approach evolved in the early 20th century when Congress legislated powers that would lie dormant until the President activated them by declaring a national emergency. This gets really good, so please do listen. These statutory authorities began to pile up, and because presidents had little incentive to terminate states of emergency once declared, these piled up too. By the 1970s, hundreds of statutory emergency powers and 4 clearly obsolete states of emergency, including one from 1950, 20 years later, were still in effect. That sounds bad, right? Oh, keep listening. Aiming to rein in this proliferation. Is that what they were aiming to do? I think not. Congress passed the National Emergencies Act in 1976, and under this law, the president still, of course, has complete discretion to issue an emergency declaration, but he must specify in the declaration which powers he intends to use and issue public updates. He's got to tweet out to us or send us some text messages if he decides to invoke additional powers, and report to Congress on the government's emergency-related expenditures every 6 months. The state of emergency expires after a year unless the president renews it, and the Senate and House must meet every 6 months while the emergency is in effect to consider a vote on terminating. They're just going to get together and say, hey, do you guys think we should vote? No? Let's go home. But of course, by any objective measure, the law has failed. Failed? I bet it has succeeded. 30 states of emergency are in effect today. So we don't really know what's in this law. We're being told what the law was meant to do. By that measure, it's failed. 30 states of emergency are in effect today. 30 states of emergency are in effect today in 2019, not counting the states of emergency that we have right now, in addition to those 30, several times more than when the act was passed, of course. Most have been renewed for years on end. And during the 40 years that the law has been in place, Congress has not met even once, let alone every 6 months, to vote on whether or not they should end the states of emergency. We are still in a state of war, by the way, a war on terror. As a result, the president has access to emergency powers contained in 123 statutory provisions calculated by the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU. Is that all there are? And do we know everything that's in them? I doubt it. These laws address a broad range of matters, from military composition and exports and public contracts, and for the most part, the president is free to use any of them. The National Emergencies Act does not require that the powers invoked relate to the nature of the emergency. The powers invoked do not need to relate to the nature of the emergency. Many other laws permit the executive branch to take extraordinary action under specified conditions, such as domestic upheaval and a viral outbreak, a global pandemic, whether or not a national emergency has even been declared. This legal regime, interesting wording for emergencies, ambiguous constitutional limits, combined with a rich well of statutory emergency powers, would seem to provide the ingredients for a dangerous encroachment on civil liberties in America. It would seem to. Yeah. This is good. Yet so far, even though presidents have often advanced dubious claims of constitutional authority, egregious abuses on the scale of the Japanese-American internment or the post-9/11 torture program have been rare. Have they? And most of the statutory powers available during a national emergency have never been used. Most of them. I don't know. Oh, but what is the guarantee that a future president or this one, blah, 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 blah. And an internet kill switch. Yeah, the president can engage in conduct that would be illegal during ordinary times, during a national emergency. We can have a bunch of actions taken here in the United States. These laws vary dramatically in content and scope. Several of them authorize the president to make decisions about the armed forces, which is usually left to Congress. Other powers are chilling under any circumstances. Take a moment to consider that during a declared war or national emergency, the president can unilaterally suspend the law that bars the government testing of biological and chemical agents on unwitting human subjects. The government has for a long time been testing biological and chemical agents on unwitting human subjects here in this country. Because we are under 30 or 40 states of emergency. The president, of course, could also seize control of U.S. internet traffic, impeding access to certain websites. One power poses a singular threat to democracy in the digital era, and that's the 1942 Section 706 of the Communications Act that was amended from 1934, which allows the president to shut down or take control of any facility or station for wire communication. We think that that doesn't mean anything for us today. Of course we don't, right? We know better, don't we? Although interpreting the 1942 law to cover the internet might seem far-fetched, to whom? Some government officials recently endorsed this. Really surprising. Reading during debates about cybersecurity legislation, and under their interpretation, Section 706 could effectively function as a kill switch in the U.S., one that would be available to the president to assume power over the U.S. internet traffic, or just shut it down altogether. Okay. Moving on. Sanctioning of Americans. Oh, this is good. I'm going to read back up here real fast. Yeah. Talking about free speech. The progress we have made is fragile, says Jeffrey R. Stone, a constitutional law scholar. What progress? You mean... No, I'm not going to talk about it. It would not take much to upset the current understanding of the First Amendment. What understanding does there need to be? We have free speech. Doesn't need to be interpreted, but we have an understanding of it currently. And all it would take is 5 Supreme Court justices whose commitment to governmental power exceeds their commitment to individual liberties. I think we got more than 5. Sanctioning of Americans. Next to war powers, economic powers might sound benign. To whom? Not to me. But they are among the president's most potent legal weapons. All but 2 of the emergency declarations in effect today were issued under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, passed in 1977. The law allows the president to declare a national emergency to deal with any unusual and extraordinary threat to national security, foreign policy, or the economy that has its source in whole or substantially outside of the United States. The president can then order a range of economic actions to address the threat, including freezing assets, blocking financial transactions. Here it talks about foreign nations and foreign nationals, but let's move on. In the late 1970s and 80s, presidents used the law primarily to impose sanctions on other nations. However, in 1983, when Congress failed to renew the law that authorized the Commerce Department to control certain exports, President Ronald Reagan declared a national emergency in order to assume that control under the IEEPA. Subsequent presidents followed his example, transferring export control from Congress to the White House. President Bill Clinton, he used it not only just to target foreign governments, but also foreign political parties, terrorist organizations, and suspected narcotics traffickers. So, marching on. President George W. took matters a giant step further after 9/11. His Executive Order 13224 prohibited transactions not just with any suspected foreign terrorists, but with any U.S. citizen suspected of providing terrorists with financial or other support. Once a person is designated under this order, no American can legally give them a job, rent them an apartment, provide them with medical services, or even sell them a loaf of bread. And that's in the article, by the way, unless the government grants a license to allow the transaction. The Patriot Act gave the order more muscle, allowing the government to trigger these consequences merely by opening an investigation into whether a person or group should be designated. Allowing the government to trigger these consequences, you can't be sold a loaf of bread merely by opening an investigation into whether or not you should be designated. Designations under Executive Order 13224 are opaque and extremely difficult to challenge. The government needs only a, quote, reasonable basis, unquote, for believing that someone is involved with or supports terrorism in order to designate him. The target is generally given no advance notice and no hearing. He may request reconsideration and submit evidence on his behalf, but the government faces no deadline to respond to that challenge. So they won't. Moreover, the evidence against the target is typically classified, which means he, the target, is not allowed to see it. He can try to challenge the action in court, but his chances of success are minimal. To scratch that zero, as most judges defer to the government's assessment of their own evidence. Most judges defer to the government's assessment of its own evidence. I got to read that one more time. Most judges defer to the government's assessment of its own evidence. So if you're a lawyer for the government, let's say you're just a lawyer and you can go to court and the judge defers to you about your assessment of your own evidence, and you always win your case. Americans have been occasionally caught up in this Kafkaesque system. Sure. Oh, in other cases, Americans significantly harmed, losing their businesses and, not having anything. Great. Despite these dramatic examples, i.e. EPA's limits have yet to be fully tested. Yeah. We don't know how far they can go. Oh. Yep. National emergency. I'm not done yet. Let's see. Oh, Americans might be surprised to learn just how readily the president can deploy troops inside the United States. Let's see. Although an order issued by IEEPA would not land targets in jail, it could be implemented without legislation and without affording targets a trial. In practice, identifying every American who has hired, housed, or provided paid legal representation to an asylum seeker, an undocumented, well, this is talking about immigration, could be targeted as well. Maybe helping somebody break out of their quarantine. Boots on Main Street. The idea of tanks rolling through the streets of the U.S. cities seems fundamentally inconsistent with the country's notions of democracy and freedom. I'm going to read that again. The idea of tanks rolling through the streets of the United States seems fundamentally inconsistent with the country's notions of democracy and freedom. We should look that word up. Notions. I can't do it right now because I got to get through this thing. Look that up. Americans might be surprised, therefore, to learn just how readily the president can deploy troops. The principle that the military should not act, not could not, cannot, should not act as a domestic police force known as posse comitatus, has deep roots in the nation's history and is often mistaken for a constitutional rule. The Constitution, however, does not prohibit military participation in police activity, nor does the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878 outlaw such participation. It merely states that any authority to use the military for law enforcement purposes must derive from the Constitution or from a statute. A statute. The Insurrection Act of 1807 provides the necessary authority. As amended over the years, now it currently allows the president to deploy troops upon the request of a state's governor or legislature to help put down an insurrection within that state. Maybe Alaska is not under a state of emergency. Pretty sure almost every other state is currently. It also allows the president to deploy troops unilaterally, either because he determines that rebellious activity has made it impractical to enforce federal law through regular means, or because he deems it necessary to suppress insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy. Terms, unfortunately for us, fortunately for them, not defined in the statute. That hinders the rights of a class of people or impedes the course of justice. Just us, meaning them. Presidents have wielded the Insurrection Act under a range of circumstances. I'm not going to go on with that. This will be a little harder to do because I'm not going to read it the way they wrote it exactly. How far can the president go in using the military within the borders? The Supreme Court, of course, has given us no clear answer to this question. Yeah, I'm not going to read all that. You should read this. The message that the Supreme Court has given is decidedly mixed. Claims of emergency or necessity cannot legitimize martial law until they can. That's basically what it says. We got some nice doublespeak there. Present within this ambiguity, presidents have explored the outer limits of their constitutional emergency authority in a series of directives known as Presidential Emergency Action Documents, or PEADs, which originated as part of the Eisenhower administration's plans to ensure continuity of government in the wake of a Soviet nuclear attack, or perhaps in the wake of a pandemic. Let's see. The contents have occasionally been described in public sources, including FBI memorandums that were obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, as well as emergency manuals and court records, although we can't see the PEADs because they're closely guarded within the government. And none of them has ever been publicly released or leaked. Good stuff. According to these sources that have been kind of trickled out there from time to time, PEADs drafted from the 1950s through the 1970s would authorize not only martial law, but the suspension of habeas corpus by the executive branch, the revocation of Americans' passports, and the roundup and detention of subversives identified in the FBI Security Index that in the 1970s contained more than 10,000 names. How many names does it contain now, 50 years later? Less is known about the contents of more recent PEADs and equivalent planning documents. Less is known. But in 1987, the Miami Herald reported that Ollie North had worked, that's Lieutenant Colonel Ollie North, if you don't know who he is, I do not recall, had worked with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, to create a secret contingency plan authorizing the, quote, suspension of the Constitution, turning control of the United States over to FEMA, appointing of military commanders to run state and local governments, and declaration of martial law during a national crisis, unquote. A 2007 Department of Homeland Security reports lists martial law and curfew declarations as critical tasks that local, state, and federal governments should be able to perform in emergencies. In 2008, government sources told the reporter for the Radar magazine that a version of the Security Index still existed under the codename Maine Corps, allowing for the apprehension and detention of Americans tagged as security threats. Since 2012, the Department of Justice has been requesting and receiving funds from Congress to update several dozen PEADs, first developed in 1989. But the funding request contains no indication of what these PEADs encompass or what standards the Department of Justice intends to apply in reviewing them. Kindling an emergency. What would happen? What would happen? Let's see. They go on to give us a hypothetical situation all about Trump. He's got bad approval ratings, and he's in a trade war with China, and he's dealing with Russian oligarchs and whatever kind of stupid dog and pony show nonsense. Frick. This is stupid. But here we have here. Should I read this? Maybe I won't read this. Well, the President can invoke Section 706 of the Communications Act to assume government control over the internet traffic inside the United States and prevent disinformation and propaganda. Of course, the essential repeal of the Smith-Mundt Act has allowed the government to use propaganda against us here in this country within our borders. So disinformation and propaganda is, in fact, every second of every day in the endless, vomitous news cycle exactly what you're fed. And you can have a national emergency declared under the IEEPA, authorizing the Treasury Department to freeze the assets of any person or organization suspected of fill in the blank. Wielding the authority conferred by these laws, the government can shut down websites and organizations based on government determinations. Yep. And, lawsuits can happen, but we can have a deployment of the Insurrection Act to federalize the National Guard in several states. The presidential alert system can be used to send text messages to every American cell phone warning of risk of violence and stay home and whatever. Shelter in place. The president can renew the state of emergency, which of course will happen. The misuse of emergency powers is a standard gambit among leaders attempting to consolidate power. Of course, they're talking just about Trump here in this article, but the misuse of emergency powers is a standard gambit among leaders attempting to consolidate power. And which of those leaders have not been attempting to consolidate power? None that I remember. Yes. The dangers posed by emergency powers that are written into statute can be mitigated through the simple, expedient changing of the law. Oh my God, how stupid that is. Committees in the House can begin the process by undertaking a thorough review of existing emergency powers and declarations. I'm sure they'll do that. Oh wait, they're all infected with the coronavirus and they're going to stay home. Based on that review, Congress could repeal the laws that are obsolete or unnecessary. Could, but won't, of course. It could revise others to include stronger protections against abuse, but they won't, of course. It could issue new criteria for emergency declarations, require a connection between the nature of the emergency and the powers invoked. There is, remember, no requirement that there be a connection between the nature of the emergency and the powers invoked, and prohibit indefinite emergencies. And it could limit the powers set forth in the PEADS, the P-E-A-D-S, that we don't know any damn thing about, except that Ollie North was drafting one to give FEMA control over the country. Congress, of course, will undertake none of these reforms without extraordinary public pressure, and of course they will never get it. And until now, the public has paid little heed to emergency powers. And now we're paying heed because they're being hammered down upon us. But we are in uncharted territory. Fixing the current system of emergency powers would be a great place to start, but we never will begin. Shalom, friends.